At age 50, David Ortiz is mentioned as one of the greatest icons in American baseball, a name tied to the golden era of the Boston Red Sox and those moments that became the collective memory of an entire generation of Americans. He is a three-time World Series champion, 2004, 2007, 2013, in which, just in 2004, Ortiz not only helped end the Red Sox's 86-year curse, but also became the face representing the revival of an entire city. He won the World Series MVP in 2013, was selected to the All-Star team 7 times, won the Silver Slugger 5 times, led the league in RBI 3 times, and finished his career with more than 500 home runs, a milestone reserved only for legends. The nickname Big Papi is not simply a name. It is a symbol of clutch hits in life-or-death moments, of composure when pressure peaks, of the guy who always shows up exactly when his team needs him most. Those numbers, titles, and cheers carried him into the Hall of Fame, turning a poor kid from Santo Domingo into the quintessential image of the American dream, where talent and relentless hard work can change a person's fate. But behind that dazzling record is another story, one mentioned less often and far heavier. Success didn't come like magic. It brought along lingering aches that stretched across many years, injuries masked with painkillers so he wouldn't let down his team or the fans. Ortiz carried the pressure to always be strong, always cheerful, always the Big Papi. The public adored even when his body betrayed him and his personal life began to crack under the brutal schedule. He once faced a moment inches from death after the assassination attempt in 2019, when a bullet from behind forced him to fight, not for titles or glory anymore, but for his family and his life. Physical pain mixed with mental terror, but it was in that darkness that Ortiz's will shone clearest. No surrender, no complaints, just quietly recovering and returning to life with a humbler attitude. The scars on his body and in his memory don't disappear, but they prove that behind the legend is a man who paid a very steep price to preserve his character, to keep standing, and to choose to live even knowing that every day after the glory is a silent battle. If you want to understand why behind those historic home runs lies an entire life full of sacrifice and pain, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. Santo Domingo is not a place that gives birth to romantic dreams, and David Ortiz's childhood had no room for beautiful fantasies about the future. There, poverty exists as a simple fact, not dramatic, not tragic in the way people often tell it, but quietly clinging to every meal, every cramped house, every morning waking up with a very real question: what are we living on today? Ortiz grew up in a large family where everyone had to learn early how to share scarcity, and kids weren't allowed to be kids for very long. The dusty streets, the empty dirt fields, the scorching sunny days without shade became the familiar backdrop of his childhood. But in that setting, there wasn't much carefree laughter, because poverty doesn't allow innocence to last. From a very young age, Ortiz understood that he didn't have the right to fail the way other kids could fail, because every mistake he made carried a cost his whole family would have to bear. Responsibility came to Ortiz earlier than his age. No one handed it to him with words, but it was there in the adult's eyes, in late-night conversations, in the heavy silence, when money became the topic no one wanted to mention but couldn't avoid. He understood that he wasn't just playing ball for himself, but for everyone counting on him as their way out. In Santo Domingo, baseball is everywhere. But for Ortiz, it didn't start as a naive dream or childhood joy. It was a means of survival, the narrow but only path leading out of the cycle of poverty that had chained his family for generations. When he held the bat, Ortiz didn't think about fame or packed stands. He thought that if he wasn't good enough, wasn't tough enough, every door would slam shut, and then it wouldn't just be him falling, but everyone he loved would fall too. That's why Ortiz's childhood had no right to dream. While other kids could think of the future as something distant, he had to face it as a matter of survival. Every practice was a reminder to himself. Don't be lazy, don't back down, don't allow yourself to be weak. He saw too many adults around him who once had hope and then lost it because they lacked opportunity or because one slip was all it took. Those stories didn't need telling. They lived in every house, every neighborhood, every man coming home empty-handed. Ortiz absorbed it all in silence, and that silence gradually became part of who he was, a protective shell that helped him endure pressures a child shouldn't have to carry. Baseball, therefore, wasn't a game. It was discipline, duty, the only way to prove he deserved the rare chance life might give. Ortiz trained with a quiet fear, always present. Fear of being left behind, fear of not being good enough, fear of one day having to return empty-handed with his family's disappointed eyes on him. That fear didn't break him. It made him stubborn, more resilient, willing to endure pain and exhaustion as long as he could keep moving forward. In Santo Domingo, no one taught Ortiz how to dream, but life taught him he wasn't allowed to quit. It was in that environment that Ortiz's character slowly took shape. He wasn't a talkative kid, nor good at showing emotions. He learned to observe, to listen, to hide his worries so he wouldn't add more burden to those around him. The smile the whole world later came to know rarely appeared in those early years. Instead, there was focus, the silent determination of a child who understood that if he wasn't strong enough, no one else could save him. The evenings coming home after practice, body exhausted, Ortiz didn't think of rest as a reward, but as preparation for the next day, when everything started over from zero. Santo Domingo taught Ortiz a bitter but necessary lesson. Life doesn't owe anyone a dream. If he wanted to escape that place, he had to pay for it himself, with sweat, with youth, by trading away the carefree years he should have had. And it was in that deprivation, in those years with no right to dream, that Ortiz formed an unshakable will, a simple but brutal belief that failure is not an option. Baseball wasn't a dream to decorate life. It was the fragile only boat in a sea of poverty, and Ortiz knew clearly that if that boat sank, it wouldn't just be him drowning. His whole family would lose their rare chance to change their lives. Leaving Santo Domingo wasn't a moment of pure hope. It was a quiet farewell, where David Ortiz carried more burdens than luggage. He left home before he was mature enough psychologically, when his understanding of the world was still raw, but his sense of responsibility was already too heavy. The plane took off, carrying him away from those familiar dusty streets to land in a vast, cold, unfamiliar country, where everything moved to a different rhythm, and where he quickly realized he was just a name easily lost in the crowd. No English, no family nearby, no protective arms. Ortiz stepped into America like a child, thrown straight into a strong current, forced to learn to swim before he could even grasp his own fear. The first days in America didn't look like a dream. They were a series of misunderstandings, unreadable looks, words he couldn't fully understand, but could still feel the doubt lurking behind them. Ortiz couldn't express his thoughts, couldn't defend himself, and didn't know how to demand anything. Every practice became a double challenge, proving his ability on the field while surviving in an environment where every social rule was foreign. He learned to nod instead of answering, learned to smile to hide awkwardness, and learned to stay silent when he didn't know what to say. That silence started as necessity, but gradually became habit, then instinct. No one protected Ortiz when he made mistakes. No one explained why a small error could be blown out of proportion, why harsh comments always seemed aimed at him. He realized very early that here, if he showed weakness, he'd be swallowed whole. So he chose to grit his teeth and endure. Grit his teeth through criticism. Grit his teeth through being looked down on. Grit his teeth when homesickness rose in long nights, lying, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, and wondering if he was on the right path. But that question was rarely allowed to linger, because whenever it appeared, he thought of his family back home, of the silent promise that he couldn't afford to fail. Swallowing humiliation became part of Ortiz's journey to adulthood, not because he accepted injustice, but because he understood that fighting back at that point would only close doors faster. He observed more than he spoke, did more than he complained. Negative feelings didn't disappear. They were pushed deep inside, where they turned into quiet fuel. Ortiz didn't learn to stand out with words. He learned to let his bat do the talking. On the practice field, every hit was a wordless reply, the only way he could affirm his existence in a world not ready to listen. Loneliness followed him like a shadow. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but persistent and enduring. Ortiz ate alone, practiced alone, thought alone. He had no long conversations to vent, no mentor close enough to check in. Everything had to be figured out by himself. Lessons learned the hard way. Small failures built into big doubts, and there were moments he wondered if his silence was making others forget he was also a human being, with feelings and fears. But even when that question arose, Ortiz didn't let himself stop, because stopping meant going back, and going back in failure was something he couldn't accept. It was in those circumstances that Ortiz's will was forged in the harshest way. He learned to endure isolation without turning it into resentment. He learned to accept that no one owed him understanding. And most importantly, he learned to believe in himself even when no one around him did. Every day that passed in America was a day Ortiz had to remind himself that this path had never promised ease, and that every sacrifice was the price for the fragile chance ahead. Over time, the silence no longer remained just a defensive reflex. It became a core part of Ortiz's identity. He didn't need to talk a lot to prove he was strong. He didn't need to complain to be pitied. Instead, he let the pain settle, let the exhaustion build up, and turned it all into a quiet, unbreakable endurance. Leaving his homeland, Ortiz carried a promise he wasn't allowed to break, and that very promise made him accept loneliness as a companion that offered no comfort, no soothing words, but always reminded him that if he fell, no one else would stand up in his place. The Minnesota Twins didn't welcome David Ortiz as a talent to be nurtured. They treated him like a problem to be solved as quickly as possible. When Ortiz entered the MLB system, he brought with him the sullenness from years of isolation. But what awaited him wasn't patience or a guiding hand for a young player from a different culture. Here, everything moved fast, cold, and unforgiving. A small mistake wasn't seen as a learning step. It was recorded as proof of a prejudice already in place. Ortiz had no time to adjust, no buffer to grow, and certainly no one stepping up to protect him when the harsh judgments started forming. In the eyes of the coaching staff and decision-makers, Ortiz wasn't a long-term project. He was viewed as an overweight player, slow-moving, poor defensively, someone who didn't fit the mold the team wanted. Practices became places where he had to prove himself every minute, every swing. But the paradox was that the harder he tried, the more he was scrutinized. One bad game could erase weeks of effort. A minor error was blown up into evidence of the lack of discipline label. No one mentioned that he was still learning to live in a foreign environment. No one considered the invisible pressures he carried from home. Everything was reduced to easy, memorable tags. Lazy, not serious, no future. Ortiz felt that impatience very clearly. He saw it in the way they wouldn't wait for him to fully recover before judging, in the glances that skimmed past him when he entered the clubhouse, in the silence when he needed an explanation. He wasn't given the chance to err and correct. He was only allowed to be perfect from the start. But for a young player still searching for his footing, that was nearly impossible. Not being protected meant all the pressure landed squarely on his shoulders, and Ortiz, already used to enduring, chose silence once again. He didn't react, didn't argue, didn't demand. He thought that if he just performed better, everything would change. But sometimes, in a system that had already reached its conclusion, individual effort wasn't enough to reverse prejudice. The whispers started coming more often. People talked about his weight, his habits, his work ethic, even though no one really knew him outside of game hours. Ortiz heard it all, even if no one said it to his face. And that vagueness was what eroded his spirit the most. There was no explosive moment to fight back against, just the steady accumulation of doubt, day after day. He began to wonder if he really lacked discipline like they said, if his silence was being mistaken for indifference, if his struggles to adapt were signs that he didn't belong here. The greatest tragedy of the Minnesota period wasn't in the statistics. It was in how Ortiz gradually lost faith in himself. He wasn't just undervalued from the outside. He started internalizing those judgments as partial truths. When a young player believes he's a burden, that his presence is more annoyance than contribution, then every time he steps onto the field, stops being an opportunity and becomes a psychological test. Ortiz played with more fear of making mistakes than joy in showing his skills. And in that unforgiving environment, fear rarely leads to good performance. There were days Ortiz left practice feeling empty, not from physical fatigue, but because the doubt had sunk in deep. He thought of his family, of the promise he wasn't allowed to break, and the harsh reality was that in Minnesota, failure seemed pre-written for him. There were no long conversations to explain things, no clear plan for the future, just the feeling that he was taking up someone else's spot, that if he disappeared, no one would truly miss him. That was the feeling of a man considered expendable in the very dream he'd traded his youth to chase. Ortiz didn't rebel. He didn't fight back. He kept training, kept silent, kept hoping his hard work would be recognized. But every time he was pushed aside, every time he wasn't trusted, that hope wore down a little more. And the most painful thing wasn't being disrespected by others. It was the moment Ortiz started thinking maybe they were right. Maybe he really wasn't good enough. Maybe he didn't deserve this chance. Those thoughts didn't explode. They crept in quietly, making him carry a vague sense of guilt, as if his presence on the roster was a mistake that needed fixing. For Ortiz, the Minnesota Twins weren't just a stop in his career. They were the first place he learned MLB's brutal lesson. Talent isn't always patiently waited for, and those coming from the margins are easily labeled and discarded. He left that phase not just with modest numbers, but with a deep crack in his self-worth. That crack made him doubt his value, made him move forward with a constant fear that at any moment he could again be seen as a burden. And from that fear, a quiet tragedy began to form. A man full of potential starting to believe that others' doubts might actually be the truth about himself. The Minnesota Twins, releasing David Ortiz in 2002, didn't happen like a big event. No press conference, no official statement, no formal goodbyes used to save face for both sides. It happened quietly, coldly, the way someone crosses a name off a list without explanation. One day, Ortiz was still part of the MLB system. The next day, his name was gone. No noise, no spotlight, no one asking how he felt. The dream he'd traded his youth, his homeland, his loneliness to pursue, died in silence, as if it had never existed. Ortiz wasn't kicked out of the stadium. He walked away on his own 2 feet, carrying a bag much smaller than what he'd arrived with. No one held him back. No one said, "Give it one more try." No one told him what had gone wrong beyond the old labels that had followed him throughout his time in Minnesota. Undisciplined, unfit, no future. In that moment, Ortiz didn't feel anger. He felt emptiness. An emptiness hard to describe, as if all the efforts of many years suddenly became meaningless with one short administrative decision. The most painful part wasn't the release itself. It was the way it happened. Not a single explanation long enough for him to understand where he'd failed. Not a handshake firm enough to say he'd tried. just prolonged silence. And in that silence, Ortiz began to feel truly invisible, as if all those days of training, those sleepless nights of worry, those moments of gritting his teeth through endurance, existed only in his own memory. MLB has no room for nostalgia, and Minnesota moved on without looking back. Ortiz left the Twins with a shame he didn't know how to name. Failure was painful enough, but shame hurt more because it made him doubt not just his ability, but his very worth. He didn't dare call home right away, not because he didn't love them, but because he didn't know what to say. How do you tell them that the only path once seen as an escape had closed? How do you explain that the family's sacrifices might have been misplaced? Ortiz delayed that call day after day, letting the worry grow in silence like a stone pressing on his chest. In those days, Ortiz lived like a shadow. He avoided long conversations, avoided others' eyes, avoided even looking in the mirror. Every time he thought of going back home, his heart tightened. Returning wouldn't be shameful if it were a choice, but returning in failure, when his whole family had pinned their hopes on him, was something Ortiz had never mentally prepared to face. He wondered if he'd overestimated himself from the beginning, if the whispers in Minnesota were truths he'd deliberately refused to hear. There was no closing ceremony for that chapter. No one rewrote the story to soften it. Ortiz had to carry it himself, like a wound that hadn't healed being torn open again. He thought of the years in Santo Domingo, of the promise he wasn't allowed to break, and now, failure wasn't just a possibility, it was the reality standing in front of him. The silence from MLB at that point was no longer indifference. It became an unspoken verdict. Some people are born not enough to keep going. Shame seeped into every thought. It made Ortiz no longer dare to dream of big stadiums, no longer dare to picture himself in another team's uniform. Every prospect shrank down to one single question. If this is the end, what do I do next? But the cruelest part was that Ortiz had no answer. He'd put everything into baseball, and when baseball turned its back, he had no backup plan. In those moments, he was no longer the future Big Papi, no longer a potential icon, just a young man standing before a void too vast. And then, in that prolonged silence, Ortiz began to realize a bitter truth. A dream can die without warning. No dramatic moment needed, no public tears. It only takes a short decision from people who don't carry your fears and hopes. Ortiz carried that feeling like a burden, not to blame Minnesota, but to ask himself if he still had the courage to continue. Because, after a dream dies in silence, the hardest thing isn't standing back up. It's rediscovering the belief that you're still worthy of another chance, even when you don't know where that chance will come from, or if it will come at all. Boston appeared in David Ortiz's life not as a glamorous invitation, but as a thin rope thrown down to someone slowly sinking in silence. After being released by the Minnesota Twins, Ortiz was no longer seen as a talent to be developed, but as a risky gamble few wanted to bet on. When the Boston Red Sox made their offer, it came without guarantees, without long-term commitments or promises of a future. It was simply a last chance, and Ortiz understood that more clearly than anyone. There was no room for mistakes, no space to start learning over again. If he failed one more time, he wouldn't just lose the team, he'd vanish from the MLB map, becoming a name that briefly passed through and was forgotten forever. Ortiz stepped into Boston with the mindset of a survivor, not someone being welcomed. Fenway Park didn't open up like a stage prepared for him. It opened like an ongoing test, day after day. He knew he couldn't ask for patience. He knew he had no reputation capital to shield him. The Red Sox were his only lifeline, but that lifeline wasn't meant for weak clinging. It demanded strength, stubbornness, and the ability to stand firm when the whole world doubted. Ortiz carried the fear of abandonment from Minnesota like an unhealed memory, and every practice in Boston stirred that memory, reminding him that one slip could make everything repeat. In Boston, Ortiz didn't play ball with a sense of freedom. He played with constant tension, like someone trying to keep balance on the edge of a cliff. Every swing wasn't just a technical play. It was a wordless plea. Give me more time. Give me one more day. The fear wasn't visible, but it was present in every movement, every moment waiting for the ball to arrive. Ortiz didn't think about becoming a star. He thought about not being allowed to fail. He thought about how, if he was undervalued one more time, there would be nowhere left to go. Baseball, at this point, was no longer the escape from poverty. It was the fragile line between existing and disappearing. Boston wasn't an easy place either. The city carried heavy history, enormous expectations, and a fan base unaccustomed to patience. Ortiz understood that here, if he didn't deliver results, he'd quickly become the target of disappointment. But unlike Minnesota, this time he didn't allow himself to sink into doubtful silence. He chose to pour everything into his swings, into preparing more thoroughly, into the discipline that people had once questioned in him. Ortiz didn't change to prove something to the experts. He changed because he had no other choice. Survival required adaptation, and he was willing to pay the price with his physical strength, with mental strain, with putting his entire sense of self-worth into every at-bat. There were nights when Ortiz left practice physically exhausted, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. The fear of being abandoned again followed him like an endless whisper, replaying the days in Minnesota, replaying the feeling of his name being erased from the list. He knew Boston could be a new beginning, but it could also be the final ending. That very uncertainty made every moment heavier, and every swing a gamble. Ortiz no longer played for joy. He played for the right to stay. He didn't allow himself to relax, because relaxing meant risk, and risk was something he could no longer afford. Gradually, in that suffocating pressure, Ortiz began to find something he hadn't had before: clarity. He understood that he didn't need to please everyone. He only needed to do well the one thing he could control. The bat in his hands became the only tool for him to communicate with the world. No excuses, no explanations, no begging, just results. And it was in that ruthless focus that Ortiz started hitting with an unusual ferocity, as if every swing was him refusing to be erased one more time. Over time, Boston stopped being just a lifeline and became the place where Ortiz placed all his remaining hope. But this hope wasn't naive. It was built on fear, on the memory of being discarded, and on the determination not to let history repeat. Ortiz didn't celebrate early, didn't allow himself to look too far ahead. He lived day by day, game by game, at bat by at bat, fully aware that one moment of carelessness could bring everything crashing down. Maybe the fans didn't see it right away, but deep inside Ortiz, every time he stepped onto the field, he carried a very human fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of becoming a drifting name, fear that all the sacrifices from Santo Domingo to Minnesota to Boston would end in meaninglessness. Ironically, that very fear became his strongest motivation. It kept him from collapsing, from self-pity. He had been pushed to the limit where only two choices remained: stand firm or disappear. And in Boston, Ortiz chose to stand firm, even if it cost him sleepless nights, constant tension, and the obsession that everything he could lose was only one missed swing away. Boston didn't give Ortiz safety, but it gave him a fragile chance to save himself, and he seized it with everything he had left, because he knew this was the last time life would allow him to stand on that edge. Eventually, Boston began to see David Ortiz differently, not as a risky gamble, not as a lucky survivor from Minnesota, but as a man capable of changing the game with one swing. The clutch hits came in the moments of highest pressure, when the entire Fenway Park held its breath, when the scoreboard hung between hope and despair. Ortiz stepped up, strangely calm, as if all the fears that had worn him down for years had been compressed into one single point: then exploded the moment the ball left the bat. Clutch hitting became his signature. Historic home runs became his own language, and the name Big Papi started being called not out of pity, but out of belief. Boston found in Ortiz what they'd waited too long for. Someone willing to carry the life-or-death moments. Someone daring to step up when everything was falling apart. But this success didn't arrive like an easy gift. It came like a harsh trade-off. Every home run that ignited the stands left another echo, quieter, deeper, inside Ortiz's body. His knees began to hurt in ways that could no longer be ignored. Not sudden pain, but slow, steady degeneration, like a reminder that the body couldn't endure forever. His back ached dully after every long flight, after every grueling series, and waking up in the mornings became the first challenge of the day. Ortiz learned to warm up longer, to move more carefully, but he didn't stop because stopping meant losing the rhythm he'd just found. Big Papi was born amid roaring applause, but Ortiz understood very clearly the hidden cost behind that nickname. Every time he stepped to the plate, he didn't just carry the team's expectations. He carried the knowledge that his body was starting to betray him. Painkillers gradually became a familiar companion, not because he wanted them, but because he had no other choice. Some days, without the meds, even bending down to pick up the bat became difficult, but Ortiz never said it out loud. He smiled, he joked, he kept the image of the cheerful Big Papi that fans loved because he knew Boston didn't need to see his weakness. They needed the hits, needed the feeling of being rescued in moments when it seemed all was lost. The tragedy of this period lies in the cruel paradox. The more successful Ortiz became, the faster his body wore down. The game-changing hits didn't come from a healthy body, but from one that had learned to endure pain as part of the job. He had no time for full recovery, no space to listen to the increasingly clear warnings from his body. With each passing season, the pain didn't disappear. It was only managed, hidden, placed behind the single priority, being on the field when the team needed him. Ortiz understood that Big Papi couldn't be absent in the big moments, and he accepted trading away parts of his life to keep that role intact. There were nights, after the fans had left, after the stadium lights went out, when Ortiz sat alone in the clubhouse, quietly unwrapping tape, quietly facing his own body. The pain was no longer drowned out by cheers. It emerged clear, raw, merciless. He knew he was paying a price, and that price wasn't recorded in any stat sheet. It didn't show up in home run totals, didn't appear in highlight reels. It existed in the mornings when standing up was hard, in the sleepless nights, in the vague worry that if his body completely gave out, everything he'd built would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. To the public, Big Papi was the symbol of joy and power, but to Ortiz, it was a role he had to live fully every day, knowing that each performance cost his body a piece of its ability to recover. He didn't complain, didn't whine, because he'd learned early on that complaining didn't help anyone survive. Instead, he accepted the pain as part of the unspoken deal between himself and his career. He hit not just with muscle strength, but with a will forged from years of poverty, from Minnesota, from the fear of being abandoned again. That's why Ortiz's success in Boston carried its own tragic shade. It wasn't the story of a talent blooming in ideal conditions. It was the story of a man rising by accepting loss, bit by bit. Every historic home run was a brief victory over time, but also one step closer to the body's limit. Ortiz understood that, and perhaps that very understanding made him cherish every moment on the field more than anyone else. He knew nothing was permanent, that Big Papi existed only for a finite time, built on sacrifices not everyone could see. The body began paying the price for his career, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow, ruthless erosion. Ortiz kept stepping onto the field, kept creating moments that history would name after him, but deep inside, he understood that each passing season was one he could never get back. Big Papi was born amid the roars of Boston, but from that point on, another battle began, quieter and more persistent, between the desire to give everything and the unavoidable limits of the flesh. And in that battle, Ortiz didn't seek total victory. He just tried to hold on for one more day, one more game, one more swing, before the price became too high to keep hiding. The fall of 24 etched David Ortiz's name into American baseball history as an icon inseparable from Boston's moment of liberation. But very few understood that the glory didn't arrive as relief. It came like a heavy wave of emotion that swept away everything he was still trying to hold on to for himself. When the championship trophy finally rested in the Red Sox's hands, when the 86-year curse was broken, the whole city cried in happiness, cried because the weight that had stretched across generations had ended. Streets overflowed with people, endless cheers, hugs from strangers who had never met, and at the center of it all, Ortiz stood there, Big Papi called the savior, the face representing the revival of a city that had suffered too long. But in the moment when all of Boston allowed itself to erupt, Ortiz didn't allow himself to weaken. He didn't dare let go, didn't dare let emotion cross the line, because deep down, he understood that the trophy wasn't an ending. It was the start of a new, heavier pressure. Big Papi was no longer just a great player. He had become a symbol, and symbols aren't allowed to get tired, aren't allowed to falter, aren't allowed to admit they're drained. Ortiz realized very quickly that victory didn't free him from responsibility. It locked him into an image the entire city wanted to see every day. After 24, every time Ortiz stepped to the plate, he didn't just carry the expectations of a team defending its title. He carried the obsession that he had to repeat his hero role. Every swing was placed under the spotlight of collective memory. What would Big Papi from that year do in this moment? And when you become the answer to a city's biggest questions, you're no longer allowed to get it wrong. Ortiz understood that just one moment of weakness, one season below expectations, and the image he'd built would start to crack. And to him, that was more terrifying than any physical pain. Glory, therefore, didn't bring peace. It brought constant vigilance. Ortiz began living in a state where he had to maintain the Big Papi image, not because he loved the role, but because he didn't want to become the next disappointment in Boston's history full of wounds. He smiled more in public, joked more in the clubhouse, as if cheerfulness was part of his professional duty. But behind those smiles was exhaustion building day by day, a feeling that he was being stretched between two poles, the real human being, with very clear limits, and the symbol the city needed to believe miracles still existed. Ortiz's body, already starting to pay the price, now faced another pressure, the pressure not to truly rest. After that historic season, he had no time for full recovery. New schedule, new expectations, new games, always waiting. Each following season, Big Papi had to prove that 24 wasn't luck, that he deserved every title given to him. Ortiz didn't dare slow down, because slowing down meant admitting he had limits, and symbols aren't allowed limits in the public eye. There were moments when the cheers had died down, when Ortiz wondered if that trophy had truly freed him. He remembered the feeling of being discarded in Minnesota, remembered the fear of being forgotten, and realized that very fear was quietly controlling every decision he made. The glory of 24 didn't erase the past. It only covered it with a brilliant layer of light, making the cracks beneath harder to see. Ortiz kept playing with his familiar intensity, but in his mind, he began carrying a new worry. If one day I'm no longer the Big Papi they need, will this love still exist? The city of Boston cried in happiness, but Ortiz cried in his own silence. Not from sadness, but from understanding that from now on, every day was a test. Big Papi wasn't allowed days off, wasn't allowed ordinary seasons. He had to live with that trophy, with that memory, as a standard that couldn't be lowered. and that very standard began eroding him from the inside, slowly turning glory into psychological burden. The glory of 24 was a moment Ortiz would always be proud of, but it was also the moment he understood that victory doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it just changes the shape of the pressure from fear of failure to fear of not being able to sustain the legend. Ortiz kept going, still hitting, still bringing hope, but deep in his heart, he knew that from the second the trophy was raised, Big Papi no longer belonged to him alone. He belonged to a city, a history, and a collective memory that demanded he stay strong forever, even if the price was the peace he'd never had a chance to hold. After the glory of 24, when David Ortiz had become an inseparable part of Boston, another front in his life began cracking quietly. No cheers, no lights, no trophy to hide it. Family, which should have been a refuge after all the pressure, instead became a space where Ortiz felt increasingly out of place. He was away from home more than he was there, not from lack of love, but because he didn't know how to exist as a husband, a father, when the cheers no longer guided the way. The relentless schedule, back-to-back flights, endless practices and games, turned the house into something unfamiliar, a brief stop between two cycles of work. Ortiz was used to being strong in public. He knew how to carry life-or-death moments on the field, how to face the pressure of an entire city, but he didn't know how to face the long silences at home. Conversations gradually grew shorter, then rarer, not from lack of things to say, but because no one knew where to start. Ortiz wasn't good at expressing emotions, wasn't good at apologizing, and even less good at explaining why he always had to leave. He thought his sacrifices were obvious, that his family would understand, would wait, would endure with him. But understanding, if not nurtured by presence, eventually runs dry. Ortiz's marriage began to fracture not from one big event, but from prolonged absence, meals without him, important occasions passing in silence, moments that should have included him but found him in another city. Ortiz didn't fight back when he noticed the distance. He didn't try to patch it with words. He chose to endure in silence, the way he'd done his whole life. He believed that if he kept performing well, if he kept bringing glory, everything would eventually be okay. But family doesn't run on the logic of wins and losses. It needs presence, needs clumsy words, needs even the admissions of fault that Ortiz had never learned to say. There were moments when Ortiz realized he was becoming a stranger in his own home. He'd returned from a long trip, carrying the exhaustion of the field, but instead of warmth, he felt a cold distance hard to name. No one openly blamed him, no big arguments, just silence thickening day by day. And that silence, for Ortiz, was more terrifying than any jeers from the stands. On the field, he knew what to do to change the game. At home, he didn't know where to begin. Big Papi could save a season with one swing, could bring hope to millions, but he couldn't save his own family from the quiet fracture. That didn't come from lack of love, but from the fact that Ortiz had never been taught how to stay, how to listen, how to set work aside, to be fully present. He grew up with survival responsibility, with the pressure never to fail, and those lessons made him a great player, but left him awkward in his personal life. Ortiz was used to solving problems with action, with effort, with endurance, but family wounds can't be healed by sheer toughness alone. The breakdown didn't happen in one day. It unfolded slowly, the way Ortiz's body wore down over the years. Each missed important moment, each time he chose silence over conversation, a piece of connection was lost. And when he realized it, he faced a painful reality. The title Big Papi held no value in his own home. There, he wasn't measured by home runs or championships, but by presence and understanding things he'd traded away too much to maintain his public image. Ortiz didn't talk much about this pain. He didn't bring it into the media spotlight, didn't turn it into a story for sympathy. He kept it to himself, like a wound he never showed, but always felt aching. There were nights when the cheers had faded far away, when Ortiz faced a failure no swing could fix. The failure wasn't on the field, but in the role he'd once thought he could handle just by trying harder. But family didn't need him to try harder. They needed him there. The greatest tragedy of this period lies in the bitter paradox. Ortiz learned never to quit on the field, but didn't know how to stay, when everything in the family needed presence more than performance. He wasn't irresponsible, wasn't selfish. He was just a man accustomed to enduring alone. And when facing collapse, the only reflex he knew was silence and bearing it. Big Papi could carry an entire city on his shoulders, but he couldn't bring wholeness to his own family. When the marriage fractured, Ortiz didn't fight back, didn't blame anyone, and didn't make excuses for himself. He accepted it as part of the price he had to pay, even though questions without answers still lingered in his heart. He kept stepping onto the field, kept smiling in public, kept playing the role of Big Papi that Boston needed. But behind that image was a man who understood that some games have no extra innings, no chance for a comeback. For Ortiz, family became a painful reminder that no matter how strong you are, some things can't be saved with willpower or silent sacrifice. And that very helplessness made this period one of the most tragic chapters of his life, one where Big Papi, for the first time, had to face the truth that not everything can be salvaged by enduring just a little longer. After his family fractured in silence, David Ortiz entered another phase, even harsher than before, one with no scandal stories, no media shocks, just a slow but ruthless physical erosion. His body was exploited to the point of depletion, not because anyone forced him, but because Ortiz himself wouldn't allow himself to stop. With each passing season, the pain stopped being a warning signal and became the normal state. Knees ached, back throbbed dully, wrists stiffened, but he still took the field, still stood in his familiar spot, because for Ortiz, showing up consistently mattered more than feeling safe. He had learned a bitter lesson from Minnesota. Disappear long enough, and people forget you faster than you think. Playing through pain was no longer the exception. It became the prerequisite for Ortiz to stay in the lineup. Pre-game painkiller injections, pills swallowed quickly in the clubhouse, short treatments squeezed between flights, all became part of routine. He didn't see it as heroic sacrifice. He saw it as the necessary cost to keep his right to stay. Some days the pain spread so wide that even turning his body made him wince. But when he stepped onto the field, Ortiz still wore that familiar smile, still swung the bat as if his body wasn't fighting back. He understood very clearly that the Big Papi image didn't allow weakness, and he didn't want to break the trust Boston had placed in him. Ortiz didn't dare take long breaks. The thought always made him uneasy. Resting meant losing rhythm, losing his spot, and worse, losing his presence in people's minds. He feared that if he disappeared long enough, the cheers would find another name to call, and baseball history would move on without him. That fear of being forgotten wasn't vanity. It was the consequence of a journey full of being discarded. He had once had his name erased without anyone looking back, and that memory never left him. So he chose to stay at any cost, even when that cost was his own health. There were moments when Ortiz realized his body was no longer a tool serving the joy of playing. It was something being consumed bit by bit to maintain an image. He felt the clear difference between his early years in Boston and this phase. Back then, pain came after the game. Now it showed up right from warm-ups. But Ortiz didn't share that with many people. He didn't want to be seen as a burden, didn't want to become a story of decline. He was too used to handling problems in silence, and his body, even as it screamed, had to learn to stay silent too. The tragedy of this period lies in the fact that Ortiz no longer played for pure joy or passion. He played out of fear, fear of being replaced, fear of being forgotten, fear that without Big Papi on the field, All the previous sacrifices would become meaningless. Every time he stood in the batter's box, he wasn't just facing the pitcher, he was facing his own limits. Every successful hit brought brief relief, but right after came the returning pain, reminding him that no victory comes free. There were nights when Ortiz returned home with his body so exhausted he had no strength left to talk. He lay there, letting the pain spread through every muscle, every joint, and wondered how much longer he could endure. But that question rarely led to rest. It only prepared him mentally for the next day, when everything started over again. Ortiz didn't allow himself to break down, because breaking down meant admitting his body had beaten his will, and that was something he was never ready to accept. Instead of noisy scandals, Ortiz's life in this phase was a series of silent sacrifices few people saw. No headlines, no public controversies, just a man pushing his limits farther every day. He understood that a sports career always has an end, but he wanted to delay that moment as long as possible, not from endless ambition, but from a very human fear that when he stopped, the world would keep going without needing him anymore. His body being exploited to exhaustion wasn't an accident. It was the result of a series of choices driven by the memory of abandonment. Ortiz chose the field over rest, chose pain over the risk of being forgotten, and in that choice, he held on to his spot while losing pieces of his health that no one could give back. This period lacked the glamorous shine of glory and the drama of sudden tragedy. It was a slow erosion, where every passing day, Ortiz had to remind himself that Big Papi's existence was sustained by his own body. And the greatest fear, the one he never spoke aloud, always lingered, haunting him with every swing. If I stop, they'll forget me. In April of 2013, when David Ortiz already carried the wear and tear of many years, Boston was torn apart by a pain no one was mentally prepared to face. The Boston Marathon bombing didn't just take lives and peace from innocent people. It shook the emotional foundation of a city already accustomed to enduring. Streets once alive with cheers fell silent. Flags flew at half-mast, and a heavy atmosphere blanketed every corner of Boston. In that moment, no one knew what to say, right? Where to stand enough? Or what to do so the pain wouldn't swallow everything. Ortiz was asked to stand before the crowd at Fenway Park, not as a player, but as a symbol. He had no script, no prepared speech, no polished words from advisors or media. He stepped out with a body already weary from years of being pushed to the limit, with a mind still carrying unhealed personal pain. But when he looked down at the sea of people below, Ortiz understood that right then, his own exhaustion no longer mattered. This city needed a voice, and that voice couldn't come from perfection. It had to come from the raw truth of someone who had endured too much. Ortiz spoke on instinct, not the instinct of a star used to cameras, but the instinct of a man who grew up in poverty, who was once discarded, who endured in silence, and knew exactly what it felt like when life suddenly turned its back. His words weren't elaborate, didn't try to soothe with lofty philosophy. They were direct, rough, and full of emotion, just like the pain Boston was going through. He didn't hide his anger, didn't try to make the tragedy feel lighter. He named the pain, named the rage, and declared that this city wouldn't let fear define it. In that moment, Ortiz wasn't just baseball's Big Papi. He became the voice of a wounded community, of people trying to stand firm amid confusion and loss. He stood there, carrying the collective pain on his shoulders, even though he was already too tired to keep playing the strong man. But sometimes, strength doesn't come from extra energy. It comes from the ability to stand when there's nothing left to lean on. Ortiz spoke not to become a hero, but to remind everyone that Boston was still Boston, a city that doesn't bow to fear. After that speech, people remembered the words, remembered the atmosphere feeling somewhat released, but few saw the price Ortiz paid. When the lights went out and the crowd dispersed, he returned to his familiar exhaustion, to pains his body had never let go of. He had used what little energy remained not for himself, but for a city that needed comfort. No one required him to do it, but Ortiz didn't know how to refuse when he felt he could help even just a little. Carrying collective pain is a heavier responsibility than any game. On the field, Ortiz knew what he could do to change the outcome. Here, he had no bat in hand, no scoreboard to tell him if he was winning or losing. He only had his words and his presence, and that very uncertainty made this moment harsher. Ortiz walked the fragile line of emotion strong enough to lift others, yet holding himself together so he wouldn't collapse. The 2013 event etched another layer of responsibility into Ortiz's life. He was no longer just the creator of sports moments. He was expected to speak for an entire city's emotions in its darkest hour. That didn't bring new glory or titles, but it left a deep mental scar. Ortiz understood that, from then on, every step he took was tied to Boston's image, to this community's pain and strength. And he accepted it, even knowing this burden was no lighter than what he carried on the field. In the days after the bombing, Ortiz kept taking the field, kept playing, as if nothing had changed. But inside, he had changed. Collective pain merged with his personal pains, creating a deeper exhaustion. He had used his voice to help Boston stand up, but no one stood up for him when his body and mind simultaneously demanded rest. And that was the tragedy of this period. Ortiz was strong not because he still had strength, but because he wouldn't allow himself to weaken when others needed him most. 2013 closed with images of a resilient city and a man standing at the center of that moment. But for Ortiz, it wasn't a victory. It was a cruel reminder that sometimes fate forces you to be strong for others, even when you're already depleted. He carried Boston's pain with the very endurance he'd built over a lifetime, and in that moment, Big Papi was no longer just a nickname. It became a responsibility, a heavy responsibility built from compassion, from memories of loss, and from the determination not to let fear define the city he had chosen as home. 2019 came to David Ortiz not looking like a final season, nor foreshadowing a tragic chapter, but in one brief moment, his entire life was pushed to the brink of life and death in the cruelest way. It wasn't in a roaring stadium, not under television lights, or the familiar cheers of Boston, but on a seemingly ordinary evening in Santo Domingo, where Ortiz had returned to catch a rare breath of home after years of living under constant pressure. He sat there, unusually relaxed, not on guard like an icon, not mentally prepared for the worst, because no one can live their whole life in a state of constant readiness for death. And it was in that rare moment of letting his guard down that fate struck. The bullet came from behind, without warning, giving Ortiz no chance to react, no time to understand what was happening. There was no heroic moment, no athletic reflex, no way to dodge. Just a dry crack of sound, a fierce pain ripping through his body, and the sensation of total collapse. Big Papi, the man who had once stood firm under the pressure of an entire city, fell in silence, not because of a missed swing, not because of a familiar injury, but because of a senseless act of violence that no achievement could prevent. Blood appeared very quickly, and with it came panic. Those around him no longer saw a legend. They saw a human being rapidly losing life. Ortiz was rushed to emergency care in critical condition. Every passing minute, and potentially the last. The bullet had caused severe damage to multiple internal organs, and the doctors understood they weren't just saving a famous person. They were racing against time to preserve the life of a man who had gone too far down the road of endurance. The operating room became the fragile line between life and death, where fame held no value, where history couldn't buy more time. In those hours, Ortiz didn't know where he was, didn't know what was happening. Only his body reacted on pure survival instinct. He had endured pain throughout his career, But never like this, not pain accepted in exchange for glory, but absolute pain, where everything could end without a chance to say goodbye. The doctors operated continuously, every move carrying extreme tension, because one small mistake and Big Papi would never wake up. This was no longer a sports story. It was humanity's most primal battle, fighting to breathe, to exist. Meanwhile, Ortiz's family waited in despair. No news report was clear enough to cling to, just long silences, where every worst assumption surfaced in their minds. Loved ones accustomed to seeing Ortiz as strong and untouchable now faced the possibility of losing him forever. No cheers, no crowd encouragement, just the primal fear that a father, a husband, a son could be taken by a random moment no one could control. That waiting was crueler than any failure on the field, because it forced people to face the truth that all glory means nothing when life is threatened. The news spread fast, and the baseball world held its breath. But Ortiz didn't hear it. He was in the middle of delirium, where the line between consciousness and unconsciousness blurred, where his body had to decide if it still had enough strength to return. Big Papi had spent his life standing firm for others, but this time he couldn't stand up on his own. He was completely dependent on the hands of doctors, on the fragility of medicine, on luck he had never trusted his whole life. That bullet didn't just pierce his body. It pierced the illusion that if you're strong enough, tough enough, you can control fate. When Ortiz finally survived the surgery, the critical danger hadn't ended. The following hours of intensive care were a tense chain of days, every vital sign monitored closely. His family didn't dare leave, because every minute could bring bad news. In that time, Ortiz was no longer Boston's Big Papi, no longer the icon of historic hits. He was just a human clinging to life, one breath at a time. And in that ruthless purity, all titles were stripped away, revealing the truth that a person, no matter how great, can fall from a moment completely unrelated to what they've given. Big Papi nearly died not because of baseball, not because of years of exploiting his body to exhaustion, but because of fate. That made this tragedy more painful than any career injury. Ortiz had accepted every risk tied to his profession, but no one prepares you for having your life stolen by a senseless act of violence. As he gradually regained consciousness, awareness returning bit by bit, the first feeling wasn't victory, but shock. He was alive, but that life felt more fragile than ever. His body was no longer the familiar endurance machine. It was a battlefield that had just survived a brutal fight. 2019 became the deepest cut in Ortiz's life, because it forced him to face the question he had avoided for years. If everything ends here, what remains? No stat sheet stood by his hospital bed. No cheers drowned out the fear. Only family, life itself, and a cold truth that Big Papi, the untouchable icon, had stood very close to the final edge. That bullet didn't just nearly end a life. It tore open every illusion of control, forcing Ortiz for the first time to look straight at his own vulnerability. After 2019, after David Ortiz stepped back from the edge of life and death, the outside world called it a miracle. But for Ortiz, it wasn't a complete return. He survived, yes, but the sense of safety people take for granted vanished forever. From that moment, his life split into two clear halves, before the bullet and after the bullet. Before, Ortiz had been used to physical pain, to pressure, to being exploited to the limit. But after, he had to learn to live with a completely new fear, one that couldn't be treated with surgery, couldn't be eased with medication, and couldn't be chased away by crowd cheers. In the early days of recovery, Ortiz realized his body had weakened. But what terrified him more was that his mind no longer obeyed. Loud noises made him startle. Sudden movements behind him sent his heart racing. Crowds, once the lifeblood energy of Big Papi, now became suspicious spaces. Ortiz began scanning constantly not to find familiar faces, but to spot potential threats. He no longer stood casually in the middle of a room, no longer turned his back to the world like before. His body might heal the wound, but his survival instinct had changed permanently. Nightmares came without warning. In fitful sleep, Ortiz relived that moment, the burning sensation in his back, the collapse, without understanding what was happening. He woke in cold sweat, heart pounding, taking seconds to realize he was still alive. Some nights, he didn't dare sleep again, afraid that closing his eyes would pull his mind back to the moment he tried to forget, but couldn't. Before, Ortiz had lost sleep from physical pain. Now he lost sleep from memory, from an invisible fear he couldn't name. The most painful thing for Ortiz was that, for the first time in his life, he had to admit to himself that he was no longer untouchable. For years he had built the image of someone who could endure anything, stand firm against any pressure, be a pillar for others. But that bullet completely shattered the illusion. Ortiz no longer believed that being strong enough was sufficient. He understood there are things you can't control, can't guard against, can't defeat with willpower alone. That truth made him humbler and more fragile than ever. Ortiz began limiting appearances in crowded places. Events that once felt routine now became psychological challenges. Every time he stepped in front of a crowd, he had to reassure himself he was safe, that the terrible moment wouldn't repeat. But reason and emotion don't always align. Sometimes, even surrounded by friendly faces, Ortiz still felt surrounded. He smiled, he shook hands, but inside was constant vigilance, as if his mind had switched to permanent survival mode. Family became his only anchor in this phase. Ortiz clung to quiet moments, slow mornings, meals without cameras, but even in that peace, fear lurked. He understood. His life was no longer a given. Waking up each day became a gift, but also a reminder that the gift could be taken at any time. That made him cherish more, but also made him more vulnerable to the smallest uncertainties. This change didn't happen loudly. Ortiz didn't go on media to talk about panic attacks, didn't turn fear into a pity story. He kept it to himself, the way he had kept so many other pains throughout his life. But those close to him noticed the difference. Ortiz joked less. His eyes were more cautious. He chose seats where he could observe surroundings, chose less crowded paths, chose control over letting go. The old Big Papi once made entire stadiums shake just by being there. The current Ortiz learned to exist in a world he no longer fully trusted. The irony is that the very moment near death made Ortiz understand the value of life more than ever. He began talking more about fear, though still very cautiously. For the first time, he admitted he wasn't untouchable, that titles, money, and legacy couldn't shield a person from violence and chance. That admission didn't make him weaker in the eyes of those who truly understood. Instead, it made him more real, more relatable to ordinary people, also living in this uncertain world. Surviving, for Ortiz, was no longer a complete victory. It became an ongoing state, where every day he had to learn to coexist with memory and fear. He didn't try to erase them, because he understood erasure was impossible. Instead, he learned to carry them as part of his new self. A self that knows true strength isn't in never being afraid, but in continuing to live even when the fear remains. This part of Ortiz's life had no cheers, no scoreboard, no historic moments to replay. It unfolded in silence, in small daily choices, in daring to step outside even when his heart raced, in daring to appear before crowds even when instinct wanted to retreat. Big Papi once saved Boston with his hits. The current Ortiz learned to save himself with honesty about his own fear, and in that fragility, he found a different kind of courage. Not flashy, not loud, but deeper and more enduring than any title he ever won. After crossing the boundary between life and death, David Ortiz no longer lived to the old rhythm of the world he once dominated. His life slowed down reluctantly, not because he wanted to, but because his body and mind forced him to change. Learning to breathe slowly, for Ortiz, wasn't a philosophical choice. It was a survival reflex after nearly not breathing at all. Every breath became a reminder that life was no longer a given, that waking up in the morning was no longer routine. It was a mercy. Ortiz began stepping back from the spotlight. No drama, no announcements, no press releases. He simply appeared less. Events that once felt essential to Big Papi's life now became optional. He no longer craved the center stage, no longer sought validation from crowds. After everything, he'd been cheered enough, loved, and judged long enough. The bullet in 2019 didn't just leave scars on his body. It stripped away his need to constantly prove his worth to the world. Fatherhood became the new axis of Ortiz's life. Not as the perfect father, not as the always-present father, but as a father who knew time couldn't be wasted. Ortiz looked at his children with a completely different feeling, no longer the unconscious confidence that he'd always be there. He was acutely aware that his presence was finite. Small moments, quiet mornings, unhurried conversations became more precious than any title. Ortiz didn't need to be Big Papi in his own home. There, he just needed to be a father who was still alive. This transformation happened in pain because it required Ortiz to let go of a part of his identity that had sustained him for decades. He had once existed on pressure, on lights, on others' expectations. Now, he learned to exist in silence. Not the enduring silence of the past, but a chosen silence. Ortiz no longer felt the need to respond to every rumor, no longer got pulled into the vortex of attention. He chose safety over showmanship, peace over glory. Charity became an important part of Ortiz's new life, but in such a low-key way that many people didn't know. No stages, no cameras, no speeches. He helped because he could, because he'd once been in a position that needed help, and because he didn't want others' pain to become a tool for his personal image. Ortiz didn't need recognition for these things. After nearly losing everything, recognition felt small, almost meaningless. What he sought wasn't praise, but the feeling that he was living right with the life he had left. Learning to breathe slowly also meant Ortiz learned to say no. No to packed schedules. No to unnecessary demands. No to showing up just to show up. This wasn't easy for someone who'd spent so long always being ready for every game. There were times Ortiz felt lost in his new life, as if he'd stepped off a race the world was still running. But that feeling quickly gave way to relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't being pulled forward by the fear of being forgotten. Ortiz no longer wanted to prove anything, because he understood that all efforts to prove ultimately mean nothing in the face of fate's randomness. The bullet didn't ask how many home runs he'd hit. The operating room didn't care which city's icon he once was. That experience completely changed his measure of value. Living, for Ortiz, no longer meant accumulating more achievements. It meant preserving what remained: health, family, clarity, and ordinary moments he'd never had time to feel before. A new calm appeared in the way Ortiz faced the world. Not coldness, but release. He no longer reacted strongly to external ups and downs, no longer let his emotions be controlled by others' gazes. This didn't come from instant enlightenment, but from sleepless nights, from panic attacks, from the understanding that every day survived was a quiet victory. Ortiz didn't need to shout it. He just needed to keep breathing. This part of life wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. No explosive moments, no cheers. It was built from small decisions, from choosing to stay home instead of going out, choosing to listen instead of speak, choosing to live slower in a world that always pushes faster. Ortiz didn't abandon his past. He just put it in its proper place. Big Papi was a completed chapter. The man still alive was the ongoing story. Learning to breathe slowly, for Ortiz, was learning to accept that life doesn't need to be loud to have meaning. After nearly not breathing anymore, every breath felt full. He lived not to prove he still had value, but because life itself had become the greatest value. And in that quiet, Ortiz found a kind of freedom the stadium lights never gave. The freedom not to strain to be an icon, but to be an ordinary, fragile human being who was still here. No miracle appeared at the end of David Ortiz's life. No final hit brought him back to the top. No comeback moment made the whole world stand and cheer one more time. The rest of Ortiz's life passed in deliberate silence, where he no longer tried to fix what was lost, nor held illusions that every wound could heal. He'd lived long enough to understand that some injuries don't disappear. They just change shape, and some prices are never repaid. Ortiz didn't collapse, but he'd paid enough. Paid with a body worn down after thousands of swings. Paid with years of living in pain without daring to rest. Paid with a family once fractured by prolonged absence. Paid with the quiet fear after the 2019 bullet, which took away his permanent sense of safety. No amount of money, no title could trade any of that back. And Ortiz, in this final phase, no longer tried to convince himself the price was worth it. He just accepted it as inseparable from the path he'd walked. Ortiz's life didn't close with a final victory. It closed with persistent existence, an existence without noise, without needing proof. He didn't come back to conquer more. He didn't try to extend the Big Papi legend in grand style. Instead, he stayed in the small things: family, quiet mornings, moments without schedules. Ortiz understood his history had been written, and the rest of his life didn't need to be an extension of glory. It needed to be real with what remained. Family became the final anchor, not as a salvific symbol, but as an irreplaceable reality. Ortiz wasn't perfect in this role, but he was present more, listened more, and avoided less. He didn't try to make up with grand gestures, because he'd learned the most precious thing wasn't atonement, it was presence. New memories were created without historical weight, not recorded in stat sheets, but they held value that even a great career couldn't match. Ortiz's memory in baseball history remains undimmed. The clutch hits, the unforgettable seasons, the moments an entire city of Boston leaned on him to believe hope was real. But even Ortiz understood that memory isn't just what others remember about him, it's also what he has to carry. And those memories aren't always beautiful. There were sleepless nights, pain so bad he couldn't stand straight, moments of fear he couldn't share. History usually keeps the light. The darkness is left to the one who lived it. Ortiz's character was worn down over the years, but never broken. He didn't become bitter, didn't shut himself off from the world, didn't deny his past. He carried his scars, visible and invisible, as proof of how fully he'd lived. Ortiz didn't call himself a victim, nor claim to be a hero. He was just a man who'd gone too far down the road of endurance and still stood after it all. There was one truth Ortiz accepted at this ending: he wasn't fully healed. The psychological wounds from the violent incident didn't vanish. The physical pains didn't fully subside. Relationships couldn't return to their original state, but that lack of healing didn't make his life meaningless. On the contrary, it clarified the nature of the strength he'd shown throughout the journey, the strength to keep living even when not whole. History doesn't stand on perfect people. It stands on those who endured long enough to become anchors for others. Ortiz was one of them. He didn't build history through invincibility, but through repeatedly returning after being discarded, doubted, hurt. He didn't save Boston with miracles, but with persistent presence in the moments it was needed most. And that persistence, not the titles, was the deepest legacy he left. At this ending, there were no cheers to close the story, just a quiet acknowledgement that a man had gone through too much to need more applause. Ortiz didn't stand on a podium looking down at history. He stood inside it, as an inseparable part, a man who'd paid enough for what he achieved and asked no repayment from life. Some people don't get healed, but history stands because of them. Because of those who accept carrying wounds so others can lean on them? Because of those who don't collapse, even when worn to the limit. David Ortiz was one of those people, and that's how his story ends. Not with a final victory, but with the weighty existence of an unbroken character. The story of David Ortiz isn't just a sports epic. It's a very human, very American tragedy, written in both glory and injury. What makes readers ache isn't the number of home runs or championship trophies, but the quiet price Ortiz paid throughout the journey. A body exploited to exhaustion, a family fractured by prolonged absence, and finally, the 2019 bullet that nearly stole his life, in one meaningless moment. In this story, Ortiz was never fully healed. The knee pain, back pain, fear of crowds after the violent incident, and lingering unease show success doesn't erase psychological trauma. The detail of Ortiz standing strong for the entire city of Boston after the 2013 marathon bombing, despite being exhausted himself, shows he carried not just professional responsibility, but collective pain too, a burden few dare speak about. Here, Big Papi isn't celebrated as an untouchable icon, but as a human who endured too long without letting go of his character. The lesson for Americans isn't to be stronger still, but to understand that true strength isn't never falling. It's continuing to live when already worn down. Ortiz reminds us that fame, money, or public image can't replace health, family, and a sense of safety. American society often glorifies endurance to the point of burnout. But this story warns that if we worship achievements while ignoring the person behind them, we'll keep creating heroes who pay too high a price. David Ortiz is honored not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't broken, and that's the deepest human value this story leaves behind. If the story of David Ortiz left you quietly reflecting on the real cost of glory and endurance, subscribe to the channel and hit follow to keep joining us on these deeply human journeys behind the legends. Thank you for staying until the very end. And see you in the next video where we continue listening to stories not just about wins, but about people.